This is the language that's dominating our public discourse about poverty in America today. It's this language of extreme otherness, yet it's at a time when nearly half of all Americans are living in or near poverty. So in light of this reality, it's safe to say that our country's fight on poverty isn't working very well. Some might say it's not working at all. And there are all sorts of reasons why this is the case, from our social services system's woeful fragmentation, which treats interconnected issues independently of one another, to the fact that most anti-poverty solutions are built around short-term fixes that don't build resiliency over the long term. And so what we're finding is huge cyclicality, and 2/3 of people who cross over the poverty line this year will be back under it within 5 years. But I didn't come here today to talk about policy or regulatory issues, because I actually believe that the root cause of why it is that we're losing our country's fight against poverty is the persistent and pervasive false assumption that the poor over here need something different than the rest of us need to escape crisis and find stability. And I think that if we can really challenge ourselves on this, that we can transform the way that we fight poverty in this country. You know, life is complicated. And it takes a lot to get by in life, much less to thrive. And we are all little people in the face of this big and wonderful, but also messy and maze-like world. And the maze is especially hard to navigate when we find ourselves on shaky ground. Now, that's not a story about poverty. That's a universal truth for us all. This little lady back here might look like Hannibal Lecter. And some days she is that intimidating. But behind the BlackBerry mask, this is my 21-month-old daughter, Billy, and my first child. And as amazing as becoming a parent has been, I wasn't at all prepared for the shaky ground that I would be on, especially in those first weeks and months of having a newborn. When she was 6 months old and I had gone back to work, but I was still totally strung out and sleep deprived, my childcare situation suddenly fell through. And even though in the grand scheme of things, that wasn't such a huge deal, in that moment, I panicked. Now, the fact is that there were a whole series of bad choices and mistakes that I had made that had led my childcare situation to fall through. But in the moment when it happened, I didn't need judgment. What I needed was moral support from my friends and my family. I needed a lot of forbearance from my colleagues. And I needed childcare recommendations from anyone in my extended network who could offer that. And in the end, I got all that and more. I was flooded with notes and calls of commiseration. I had more quality referrals than I knew what to do with. And at my cushy white-collar job, where I just so happened to be the boss, I was able to work for as long as I needed to from home until I resolved the situation without ever any threat of reprisal. Childcare issues seem to be a pretty standard fare rite of passage for parents, something that should just be a blip on the screen like it was for me. But most people aren't that lucky. And every day in our Lyft offices across the country, we meet people who are in true crisis, so having fallen into homelessness. And typically, the first domino that tipped the chain that resulted in falling into homelessness was something seemingly benign, like having lost childcare. But far from being flooded with support and options or buoyed by an accommodating workplace, most of our clients, when they have their shaky ground moment of losing childcare, are pretty quickly terminated by an hourly employer because they maybe needed to take a half a day off of work to deal with the situation. And when they then turn to the public social services system that was theoretically set up to help them, in all likelihood they're met with endless lines, indecipherable paperwork, and ultimately a slammed door and the strong message that it is your fault that you ended up in this situation because you failed to take personal responsibility for your life. Two similar situations and two vastly different outcomes. And all that separates us is this arbitrary income threshold that social scientists came up with a couple decades ago called the poverty line. Now, I think if we were to go back to the premise that we all need the same things in moments of crisis, we would build our programs this way. We would recognize that economic resources are totally necessary, but not at all sufficient if what we actually care about is long-term progress. We need to be able to build up our internal tools, such as our stores of confidence and our ability to advocate for ourselves. And we also need strong community connections that allow us to have people to turn to when we hit moments of struggle, and that provide social networks that open up options for us. What we've found over the last 10 years of work with more than 60,000 families at Lyft is that it's actually the internal and community dimensions that accelerate and protect the economic gains that our families achieve. This is the crux of the Lyft approach, and I'll be the first to say that it is completely unoriginal. In fact, this is how we've been building the middle and upper class in America since our founding. It's even the cornerstone of business school pedagogy, where we recognize that leadership development and social network creation are the engines of personal economic gain. But where this goes from being an unoriginal idea to being something that could be revolutionary is when we start applying it to poor and low-income people, and we find that it actually has the same impact. So meet Angela Allen. She is one of the amazing 60,000 people that we've worked with at Lyft that I referenced before. When Angela came to us first 3.5 years ago, she had just gotten through a bitter separation. She was in the midst of a terrible battle with breast cancer. And because of her illness, she had lost her job, and the home in which she had raised her children had gone into foreclosure. So talk about a shaky ground moment. I mean, Angela's whole world had been thrown off of its axis. Fast forward to today, and with Lyft's help, Angela has gotten all the medical support she needs and is cancer-free. She was able to save her home and refinance and restructure her mortgage. And she now is working a full-time salaried job with benefits as a patient advocate. She's also hugely civically involved in her community, serving as her neighborhood block captain and volunteering to help spread the word about Lyft to others who might need our help. If you were to ask Angela, not some guy in a white coat with a clipboard, but Angela, what it was that allowed her to achieve such transformational change, she would say that it all started the first time she walked into a Lyft office and she was treated with dignity and respect. And sadly, she had never had that experience before in a social services context, and it gave her this huge jolt of confidence. From there, she would say that it was about the relationships that she forged with Lyft advocates who created this community around her at a time of extreme isolation. And she says that it was the isolation, not some lack of inherent skills or strengths, but the isolation that's what was keeping her from making forward progress. You know, from there, Angela really did the rest. I mean, we opened some doors, we offered resource connections, but it was Angela who seized control of her future. Angela is no welfare queen. Angela is no mooch. What Angela is the much more real face of poverty in this country. And Angela also is the face of what's possible when we treat people the way that we would want to be treated ourselves. So what can we as a community of philanthropists and nonprofit leaders and volunteers do about this to change the game together? Well, we can start off by re-examining our language, because language is really the prime manifestation of our assumptions, and that's where this all starts, right? And I'm not talking about political correctness here. I'm talking about thinking about the ways that, unknowingly, we might use words like self-sufficiency that actually serve to reinforce the double standards and the sense of otherness that actually gets in the way of solutions to help people who are struggling in poverty. We can also change the way that we give. People don't operate in silos, so we can't disconnect our employment situation from our housing situation, from our childcare situation, but that's exactly how we fund poverty programs in the United States. We also disconnect generations from one another, even though we all know that the destinies of parents are intertwined with the destinies of kids. We can fund more holistically. And finally, we can change the way that we measure what we do. If we hadn't asked Angela what it was that helped her find success, we would never have known that dignified treatment was a total catalyst for economic change. And we might have made the mistake of thinking that Lyft, not Angela, should take credit for her progress. There is so much that we can learn by asking our own constituents how they would evaluate our work. So we together can commit to the fact that any strong evaluation program needs to have a strong constituent voice component. So this all sounds like a lot, and you may be asking yourself, what do I do from here? Well, this is a group of leaders. You have convening power. And when you talk, people listen. So my hope is that where you'll start is by telling your story. And not your resume or your job interview story, but your shaky ground story. That story of a time of crisis, of a time of uncertainty, and all of the help that it took to help you get through it. It can be a story from years ago, but I would bet that every person in this room could tell a story from the last year of what it took to get your mom into that nursing home, of what it took to go through months of rehab after the knee surgery, of what it took to get that loved one into addiction treatment. We all have these stories, and your story matters so much right now, especially if you tell it honestly and courageously and over again. Because telling your story is the first step in waging today's war on poverty, which is recognizing that the other is us. So thank you for giving me the chance to tell my story.